Before I talk about the projects I've had in lockdown, I thought you might like to see my two workshops. I'm lucky enough to have a dirty workshop down the garden and a clean workshop in the house. I built this workshop about 15 years ago so that I have a good place to do my woodworking. It's basically built on 6-foot sections, 4 along the front and 2 at each end. They're 4 inches deep. It's made out of 4x2, which allowed me to have a lot of insulation because I was very keen that the workshop would be able to be used during the winter as well as the summer. I didn't want to build something I could only use for a couple of months of the year. So that's what I did. I built it in 6-foot sections and then one day bolted the whole thing together. It has along the back a 25-watt greenhouse heater which keeps a nice ambient temperature all the year round. We start over this end of the workshop. This is my wood store. I've collected quite a bit of wood over the years. I've been woodworking for over 60 years, but I was very lucky a few years ago that a friend of mine who's a 3rd generation cabinet maker phoned me up and told me that his wife had been promoted. She now earns far more than he did as a cabinet maker, so he's becoming a house husband and would I like the contents of his wood store. I jumped at this, and one Saturday afternoon he dumped on my drive a transit van load of wood, which I sorted out, and you can now see I have a good selection of old mahogany, oak, walnut and scraps of softwood. Up the top there's a good selection of rosewood and ebony. One thing I would say that if anybody in the branch ever needs a piece of wood to match on a clock case or anything like that, they're more than welcome to come and see me and see what I've got. If I've got anything to match their requirements, please, if you need any odd bits of wood, try me first. You're more than welcome. I don't think I'll ever use this lot in my lifetime. It's a selection of old timbers. I have some new mahogany and some new oak. I was very lucky when our daughter moved to Yorkshire a couple of years ago to find the most fabulous wood supplier that I've ever come across in Ripon, called Duffields. I think they're the largest supplier of timber in the country. When I went to see them, they were more than helpful. At the time they told me they had at least £5 million worth of oak in stock. I said, oh, I only want a couple of planks, but that didn't seem to worry them, and they were very helpful. I specifically wanted quarter sawn oak, which you can see here with the Medalla rays, and they very carefully and kindly sorted me out a couple of planks, which are absolutely fabulous. You can imagine that as a replacement door on an oak cased long case clock. For the wood store, my woodworking machinery is laid out across the back of the workshop. The first machine I've got is a bobbin sander. This is particularly useful and designed for sanding curves. My wife is a classical guitarist, and I've made her guitars, and this was particularly useful for sanding the curves in a classical guitar. Then we move on, and this is the workhorse of the workshop, of course, my circular saw, which is extremely accurate and is used virtually on a daily basis. I have a chop saw. This chop saw I bought actually when I built the workshop, so it's 15 years old, and again is very useful for cutting accurate angles, not only 90 degrees but everything between 90 and 45. So I use that. It's sitting on a router table. This router table is what I use for specific mouldings when I need to make a moulding. This router table is absolutely indispensable. It's superb, and you can make some really fine, accurate mouldings on that. We then move on. This is a belt sander. This is very, very accurate. As I mentioned before, I've made classical guitars for my wife, and the top of a classical guitar has to be very accurately thickness to be made to a very accurate thickness, probably about 1.7 millimeters. And this is the tool which you use to sand the top to get a very accurate thickness. It's also absolutely superb for when you have saw cut veneers, when you're repairing a clock case, to get the thickness of the veneers down to a specific depth. So absolutely invaluable, bought for classical guitars, but absolutely indispensable for clock case repairs. Underneath is a thicknesser, planer thicknesser, which again is fabulous for reclaimed timber, because you can thickness all the timber to the same thickness when you're making carcasses, again for cases. Finally, in the woodwork department is my large bandsaw. This proved invaluable when we had the clock case course and we needed to cut a deep curve in the bottom of a dial clock. Absolutely fabulous. Not used very often, but when you need it, you need it. At the end of the workshop, there are cupboards with hand tools in and two large benches, which you need when you're working. Through from the woodwork department is the metalwork department. This is very simple. I've only been doing metalwork now for 2 or 3 years, really since the workshop at the Soper Hall was set up and inspired me to have a go. I have a simple lathe at one end by the window, a milling machine and drilling machine which I find invaluable, all the tools to work with these two pieces of equipment, a metal store and a sharpening bench which is at the end. So that is the metalwork department. On the way from the garden workshop to my indoor workshop, we passed through my wife's music room, Wendy's music room, and these are a few of the instruments I've made her. This is a classical guitar with a cedar wood top, rosewood back and sides, an ebony fretboard. That's one of her guitars. This is another one, a flamenco guitar with a maple back and sides, and again this has got a spruce soundboard, rosette, ebony fretboard and rosewood headstock and saddle. Also, last Christmas I had some fun and made Wendy some ukuleles. We now move into the clean workshop inside the house. On this wall at the back you will see some of the clocks I've put together. This long case clock, this oak long case clock, was one of the first clocks that I put together. The movement was original, recycled. I made the dial and the case. At the time, Jacqueline Grice painted the dial for me, showing scenes from prints of gentlemen going sporting shooting with flintlocks. At the time I was very interested in antique firearms and often went shooting with an original flintlock from the 1815 period, and this was the inspiration for the dial painting on this clock. It's interesting to note that at the time there was two gunsmiths, the Manton brothers, who were probably the finest gunsmiths, flintlock makers that the country's ever produced, and they actually produced a clock. This clock they submitted for the Longitude Prize. The idea was that the mechanism was run in a vacuum. Rory tells me that this clock has survived and is in the Science Museum in Sydney, Australia. So that's a little bit of a connection between antique firearms and clocks. Moving on, unfortunately I didn't make the quartz clock at the top, but next door to that is the twin fusee dial clock with visible pendulum, which I put together, and of course a lot of you will recognise the clock at the bottom, which was the dial clock that we made in Home for a Fusee. This section over here is my reference section. There's a few HJ's, clock magazines and reference books that I refer to when needed. On this bench we have work in progress. I think that they're all on test at the moment, ready to go back into their cases. All three cases I've made, but we'll talk about that later when we look at what I've been doing during lockdown. It's the main bench where you'll find me at most of the time, working away on my various projects. Coming to this end of the workshop, we have stains, polishers, various chemicals, waxes, and my good old horological toolbox. Right. Now that you've seen the workshops, I'm going to talk about the projects I've had during lockdown. I've been very busy, and the first project I had was for some friends of ours. I had a call to say that they were having some building work done, and the clock that was in their garden was in need of restoration. It was covered in ivy, and the ivy had got into the brickwork, destroyed the brickwork, but also there was a clock that was on the brick wall that was covered in ivy. It was completely, the ivy was growing into the clock and was not working, and they wondered if I could restore it. I said if the builders took it down and they brought it round, as it was during lockdown, put it on the drive and I'd have a look at it. Lo and behold, they arrived, but I was then told that while the builders were taking the clock off the wall, they dropped it and smashed it. So I had quite a project before me to restore the clock. I wasn't going to do the electrical work because I know nothing about electrical work, but thankfully Mick Welsh offered to make the clock safe and have a look at the mechanism. So I handed that over to him and I took a look at the woodwork. The first job I had was to have a look at all the parts that had been delivered, clean them up and see what work needed to be done. That's a picture of the main part of the clock, and the next picture is of the brackets that were underneath that supported it on the wall. It was very soon evident that the plywood casing was in very good condition, although slightly battered and bruised, but the softwood framework was completely destroyed. So the first job I had to do was to make a new framework with and then fix the plywood to the framework, which I did. As you can see from this picture, that the clock is beginning to look a bit like a clock and coming together quite nicely. I then decided that the clock would look nice painted white, and that the old felt roof was not very attractive, so I got some synthetic slates and cut these to fit the new roof. Mick by this time had returned the movement. He'd serviced the motor, made everything electrically safe, and we reinstalled it in the clock case. The clock was now ready to be returned to the owner to be put back on the rebuilt garden wall. This is the finished project, reinstated on the garden wall, and looking very smart, I think. Apparently the clock movement and the dial were rescued from Donald Campbell's house in Reigate, the racing driver and land speed record holder, when the house was demolished in the 50s. By the time I'd finished the clock for our friend's garden wall, it was the end of June. By this time, in lockdown, I'd painted the whole of the upstairs of the house, all the bedrooms, and there wasn't a weed in the garden. So I was looking for something to do. I decided it might be an opportunity to catch up with all the clock cases that I've been working on for the past 7 years. So that is what I intended to do. I first got interested in antique clocks and cases about 25 years ago when a friend of mine suggested that we could go to the Brunel Clock Fair and have a Sunday looking at the stalls there. I was very interested and we went down, and after an interesting morning looking around, I realised that I'd fallen in love with English bracket clocks. When I saw the price, I was slightly taken aback. At that time, a nice one was between 10 and 14,000 pounds, which was a little bit more than I was prepared to spend, and it would almost been suicidal to tell the wife that I'd spent that on a clock. So while talking to one of the stall holders, he said, "Are you any good at woodwork?" I said, "Well, I love woodwork." He said, "Well, why don't you buy a twin fusee movement and make a bracket clock yourself?" He said, "By the way, I've got an old bracket clock case that's smashed up. I don't think it's repairable, and you're more than welcome to have it." So I parted with £400 or so, and he gave me this rather smashed up clock case. I took it home, looked at it, cleaned it all up, put it back together again, and took it back to show him. And from that moment on, I spent 6 or 7 years working for various clock restorers, repairing their clock cases. At the time, I also made from scratch new cases, about half a dozen. John Tetlow, who was a local clockmaker, a clock repairer, restored the movements. I knew nothing about movement restoration, and I made the cases and sold them. And it was quite a worthwhile project, and I reinvested the money in buying other clock movements and pieces that I thought in the future would be useful. While working on restoring bracket clock cases, I learnt an awful lot about their construction, and I found that wherever the clock came from, the cases were virtually identical. They had the same form of construction, the same size, the same number of dovetails, which leads me to think that perhaps if anybody knows, and I've been trying to find out for years, Jonathan Betts can't help me, did anybody mass produce these cases? They're so similar, they could have come out of the same factory, or perhaps there was even a directory of plans that people could use, a bit like Chippendale produced a book of plans for his furniture. So please, if anybody ever comes across any information about clock case makers, I would be more than grateful to hear from them. As I say, over the 7 or 8 years that I restored cases, I learnt an awful lot about their construction. And when I make my facsimile cases, they are identical in every way I can possibly make them to the original specification. Most clock cases start off with a oak carcass. That's a nice strong base. Oak was a very common wood in use at the time, So it wasn't a rare wood, so they used oak for the carcassing. And it was a very specific oak. It was quarter sawn oak. If you remember down the workshop, I showed a piece of quarter sawn oak that I got from Yorkshire. But the reason that quarter sawn oak is so important is that it's a very wasteful way of producing oak boards, but it's a very strong and stable form of producing them. The vertical lines, the grain goes vertically and it keeps it nice and flat and stable. If you use plank sawn oak, the grain runs in a circle, and over time you get a very strange piece of wood. And so quarter sawn, although it's more expensive, is the most stable form of oak to use, and was commonly used in clock case carcassing. On top of the basic carcass, sawn veneers were stuck to build up the shape and to cover the carcassing, and these were hand sawn. At this time there was no mass production of veneers, so they were thick, probably about 2 mil, 2.5 mil thick, and they were used to cover the carcass. Modern veneers are totally unsuitable. They are curl cut, that's the log spins against a knife, and they are less than 0.5 millimetre thick. Totally useless for clock restoration work. As I say, the veneer is applied to the basic carcass, and then mouldings are applied. I make my mouldings in the traditional way, using softwood as a basis and applying mahogany, rosewood or walnut to that basic base, and then these are shaped and moulded using, as I pointed out down the workshop, the router table or router table. I make use of the router table for cutting trim and mouldings like this. Thicker mouldings are veneered using a press, so that the veneer is damped down, put into contact with the surface, no glue at this stage, then that is clamped on top and squeezed, and I let that dry overnight. When I take it apart in the morning, the veneer has actually taken that shape up and I can glue it in place. I don't glue it when it's damp, because that tends to dilute the glue and it forces it through the pores in the timber and you get a horrible mess. It's very difficult to finish. So that's the way I do deep mouldings. A useful tool is a scratch stock. This is used to form small mouldings. The plate in the front is shaped and that's scratched along the wood. It's very effective for small mouldings. This is the scratch stock I use. I also make my own cutters for my router table. This was a cutter head that Trent bought out many years ago, and it was a cheap option because you could buy replaceable blades to fit it. You only needed one cutter with adjustable blades. I threw away the blades and I now make my own to match mouldings that I use on the clock cases. One of the problems that I encounter when making clock cases is the fact that you can't go to B&Q and buy the fittings, so a lot of them have to be handmade for the clock case. There are 1 or 2 parts that are available through various brass casting firms. This is one I particularly like, Optimum Brass, and they produce a range of different castings that are suitable for bracket clocks. Unfortunately, things like dial surrounds I have to make from scratch. These I spin on my woodworking lathe, and then they can be used as in this case, in a situation like this. One of the most difficult things to find is the surround for a bracket clock door, archtop bracket clock door. I found that I could buy half round brass strip, then cut it in half into a quadrant, and then by heating the brass up I could do an arch and then put the whole lot together to form the door surround for the bracket clock. This is one in situ. Another part that's difficult to get hold of is a movement mounting bracket, which I have fabricated out of some 1/8 brass sheet, a 1/2 inch square bar which I drilled a hole in, then cut it into quarters, and then silver soldered the whole thing together. The final problem is that you can not buy locks for these clock cases, so I've had to fabricate, and I make up my own locks to suit the case in question. And these are 3 of my locks that I make. That's for a chamfer top bracket clock, and these 2 are for bracket clocks, bell top bracket clocks. I'd like to look at one of my clock cases in a little bit more detail to show you how it all fits together. As I explained earlier, the carcass is made out of oak, and then it's veneered in Cuban mahogany. This I cut from a old mahogany table leaf which I bought at auction to get the correct thickness, and veneered the carcass. Additional to that, the mouldings that go around the bottom, and the mouldings that make up the top. So that's how the top is put together, and then we can see, as you said earlier, that is how I form the arch, and with the quadrant make up the rest, all silver soldered together. Inside the front door there is the mask and the front door lock, which again I've had to make. So that's what the clock looks like with the door open. The sides are brass frets backed up with pure silk material to let the sound out and knock the dust in. There's various intricate mouldings around the top, and then there's the back door looking into the back of the clock with the movement support brackets there and there, and again a different style of lock for the back door. So and then there's a nice oak platform for the movement to sit on. After my initial interest in clocks, unfortunately, because the price dropped, it wasn't an economic proposition for people to have them restored. So unfortunately, after 5 or 6 years really working for the clock trade, repairing the cases, I ceased to be required. So for a long period I didn't do any clock work, and everything was put away. And my interest was rekindled when the branch opened its workshop, and I thought, well, you know, it makes sense now that if I can restore the movements, it's worth making the cases for them. So that is what I've done, and thanks to James, Ron and Antonio, over the last few years I've restored half a dozen twin fusee clock movements that then needed cases. So this was my project for the rest of the year, to make the cases and to finish them off and to put the clocks together while I had the time and I could concentrate on them. And this is the result of what I have done over the last 6 months. The 6 clocks that are all up and running. They're all slightly different. They all started off just as a twin fusee movement, but I thought I'd make them all a little bit different, just for a bit of variety. These 2 dials I made, and they're engraved by Peter Fox. That has a centre sweep date and a strike silent. That's just got a strike silent in the arch. This is a movement that has on the back Thomas Hunter, and luckily in the Georgian bracket clock book there is a bracket clock by Thomas Hunter. It's interesting to note that Thomas Hunter's name is engraved on the back plate, but Thwaites and Reed is engraved on the front plate. And I was able to get a picture of this when I took it along to Brenda, who made a fantastic job of the dial, absolutely as a copy of the picture shown in the Georgian bracket clock book. In fact, a lot of people think that's their favourite. This is a chamfer top bracket clock that I made as a bit of a change. I happened to particularly like them. It was different from the others, so it was a bit more of a challenge. And while I was doing this, Richard Jeffcoat built one with my help, parallel to me making this. So he has a almost identical chamfer top bracket clock. His is a little bit more flashy, put a bit more brass on, but basically they're both the same. This is another case. This was not so much a case I built from scratch, but the one that was smashed up and split. All the oak had dried out and split, and the whole thing had fallen apart. So that was a rescue job. This clock I re-veneered the front and inlaid some brass to make it a little bit more attractive and not so plain. This is the last clock I'm working on. Again, I haven't made the case from scratch. I found it, the case, while I was on holiday in Norfolk. We went to a shop called Old and New Times, and out the back in various sheds there was like a clock graveyard, and this one I particularly liked the look of and was attracted to it because on the back door there was a label, and the label read, "This clock stood in the hallway of the Evers Creek House, Evercreek, when occupied by the late Baron, 3rd Baron Talbot of Malahide." This is what I bought. That's all there was, plus the front and the back door. Luckily the glass was still intact. I don't know what had happened to the rest of the case, but perhaps somebody was trying to restore it and gave up. But I have completely rebuilt it, and luckily I found a movement to fit it. Brenda at the moment has the dial which she's painting, and so that'll be my final clock for the moment. It's very interesting. When I started doing some research into the Baron, I found he was a very interesting guy. He was born in Ireland in 1777. He got a degree from Trinity College, Dublin, and then moved to England, to London, and worked for the Foreign Office. In about 1805, he was part of a delegation from England to go to France to try and make a treaty with Napoleon to bring peace to Europe. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, it failed. But he actually was inspired when he went to France to move around Europe and try and find out what the powers in other countries were thinking about. I mean, at the time, people tended to change their allegiance depending on who was winning the war. And over the years, he became one of Britain's greatest spy masters. He worked all the way from Russia to Copenhagen to Denmark. But unfortunately, he was betrayed and he moved to England. He escaped and moved to England and moved to Somerset, where he settled. And this was where the clock stood in his hallway. I was lucky enough to find a local estate agent who had a picture of this fine Georgian house. Unfortunately, the house is now divided into smaller accommodation, but at one time it was quite a spectacular house, and I can imagine this clock sitting in this hallway. I've recently found out that somebody's written a lightweight novel about the adventures called Into the Lion's Den of the Baron when he was a spy in Europe. A little bedtime reading when I get time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little tour. As I say, I will gladly help anybody with timber, expertise, anything I can do to help them with clock cases, I'll gladly do. So thank you for watching and stay well.